At -71 degrees, the snow doesn't just freeze you, it waits for you to stop moving. Ethan Carter heard those words years ago from an old truck driver in northern Alaska, but standing alone in the middle of the Siberian mountains, he finally understood what they meant. The wind did not howl like a storm. It whispered, thin and sharp, sliding through layers of clothing, through skin, through bone, until every breath felt stolen from inside his chest. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, pale and lifeless beneath a sky the color of steel. There were no roads anymore. No lights. No sound except the crunch of Ethan's boots sinking deeper into the drifts with every exhausted step. His GPS had died almost 2 hours earlier. The radio clipped to his jacket crackled once before fading into silence. Somewhere behind him, buried beneath layers of fresh snow, his snowmobile rested upside down at the bottom of a frozen ravine. He had tried walking east at first, then south, but the blizzard erased everything within minutes. Tracks vanished. Landmarks disappeared. Even the mountains seemed to move inside the storm. Ethan pulled his scarf tighter across his face and forced himself forward another few feet before stopping again to catch his breath. His lungs burned from the cold. Ice clung to his eyelashes every time he blinked. He checked the compass strapped to his wrist, but the needle trembled uselessly as gusts slammed against him from every direction. For the first time all night, real fear crept into his thoughts. Not panic, something quieter. The kind of fear that settles deep inside a person when they realize nature has already decided the outcome. His fingers were numb now. Even inside insulated gloves, he could barely feel them anymore. He flexed his hand repeatedly just to make sure it still moved. The temperature had dropped far below anything his body was built to survive. Out here, people didn't freeze all at once. First came the exhaustion, then confusion, then the dangerous warmth that tricked the body into giving up. Ethan knew the stories. Experienced hikers lying down in the snow convinced they only needed a few minutes of rest before they never woke up again. He swallowed hard and kept walking. One more ridge, he told himself. Maybe there would be shelter beyond it. A cabin, trees dense enough to block the wind. Anything. But when he finally climbed the rise ahead, his stomach dropped. Nothing waited on the other side except miles of frozen wilderness disappearing into white emptiness. The storm swallowed the horizon whole. Ethan lowered his head as another blast of wind nearly knocked him sideways. His left knee buckled painfully beneath him. He hit the snow hard enough to send ice spilling down the collar of his jacket. For several seconds he stayed there, breathing heavily, too tired to stand again. The snow beneath him felt strangely soft, comfortable even. That frightened him more than the storm. He forced himself upright with a groan and stumbled toward a cluster of black rocks jutting from the mountainside. Maybe he could block the wind for a minute. Maybe he could think. But halfway there, Ethan suddenly froze. Not because of the cold, because something else was moving nearby. At first he thought the storm was playing tricks on his eyes. A pale shape appeared high above the ridge line, almost invisible against the swirling snow. Silent. Watching. Ethan's pulse slowed into something heavy and uncertain as the figure stepped carefully across the rocks. Large paws. Long tail. Thick white fur dusted with silver shadows. A snow leopard. The animal stood perfectly still less than 50 yards away, its pale eyes locked directly onto him through the storm. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Predators were not supposed to survive this high in the mountains during weather like this. Yet there it stood like part of the blizzard itself. Calm. Unmoving. Ancient. For a moment neither of them moved at all. Then somewhere far behind Ethan, deep within the storm, another sound echoed across the frozen mountains. A low distant howl. Then another. And another. The howls rolled across the mountains like something carried by the storm itself, distant at first, but growing sharper with every passing second. Ethan turned slowly toward the sound, his chest tightening as dark shapes began moving through the white haze below the ridge. Wolves. More than he could count clearly through the blowing snow. Their outlines appeared and vanished between gusts like shadows drifting across the ice. Ethan stumbled backward instinctively, his boots slipping against frozen rock. The cold had already drained too much strength from his legs. Running was impossible now. Even standing felt difficult. He looked back toward the snow leopard, expecting it to disappear into the mountains the moment the pack arrived. But the animal did not move. It remained above him, perfectly still against the storm, its pale fur blending so completely into the snow that only its eyes remained visible. Calm. Watching. Ethan could hear his own breathing growing uneven beneath the scarf wrapped around his face. Every survival instinct inside him screamed to keep moving, but exhaustion clung to his body like chains. The wolves below spread wider across the ridge, their careful movements almost silent beneath the wind. They were not charging. They were waiting, studying him. Ethan knew enough about predators to understand what that meant. Weakness changed everything in the wilderness. Out here, an injured traveler became part of the landscape. Just another living thing trying not to disappear beneath the snow. Ethan reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out the small emergency flare he had been saving. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped it. He struck the ignition once. Nothing. Again. A weak spark flickered before dying instantly in the wind. His stomach sank. The wolves kept moving closer. One stepped onto the ridge no more than 60 feet away, its gray fur rippling beneath layers of frost. Another appeared to his left, then another behind it. Ethan backed toward the rocks until there was nowhere else to go. The storm had erased every path down the mountain. He could barely see more than a few yards now. Snow hammered against his face hard enough to sting exposed skin. Somewhere deep inside the blizzard, ice cracked like distant thunder. Then something changed. The snow leopard moved for the first time. Slowly, almost silently, it climbed down from the ridge and stepped between Ethan and the wolves. The entire mountain seemed to pause. Even the pack hesitated. Ethan stared in disbelief as the leopard lowered its head slightly, not aggressive, not afraid, simply present in a way that felt ancient and unshakable. Snow gathered along its thick white fur while the wind curled around its body like smoke. The wolves stopped advancing. One gave a low warning growl that disappeared beneath the storm. The leopard did not answer. It simply stood there facing them, its tail moving once across the snow. Ethan could not understand what he was seeing. Predators did not protect strangers. Nature did not work that way. Especially not here. Especially not at temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Another gust tore across the ridge, nearly knocking Ethan off balance again. His vision blurred for a moment. He blinked hard, trying to stay focused, but exhaustion kept pulling at him from somewhere deep inside his body. He had not eaten since morning. His water bottle had frozen solid hours ago. Every breath scraped painfully through his lungs now. He leaned heavily against the rocks, fighting the dangerous urge to close his eyes just for a few seconds. The wolves circled wider, searching for an opening. The leopard shifted slightly to follow their movement, always staying between them and Ethan. Then, without warning, the animal glanced back toward him. For only a second their eyes met through the storm. Ethan expected hostility, wildness. Instead, he saw something colder and stranger. Awareness. As if the leopard understood exactly how close he was to collapsing. The animal turned immediately and began walking toward a narrow opening hidden deeper among the rocks. After several steps it stopped and looked back again. Ethan frowned weakly through the snow. The wolves remained behind them, watching, waiting. Another howl echoed closer than before. The leopard stared at Ethan one final time before disappearing into the white storm ahead. And somewhere inside the freezing silence of the mountains, Ethan realized the animal was trying to lead him somewhere. People think freezing to death feels painful until the moment the cold becomes quiet. That was what frightened Ethan most. Not the wolves behind him. Not the storm swallowing the mountains. It was the growing numbness spreading through his body with every step after the snow leopard disappeared into the white haze ahead. He followed the tracks anyway. Deep paw prints pressed into fresh snow, steady and deliberate, leading between narrow cliffs where the wind screamed loud enough to shake loose ice from the rocks above. Ethan stumbled after them as fast as his exhausted legs allowed. His breathing had become shallow now, uneven clouds freezing instantly against the scarf wrapped around his mouth. Every few seconds, he looked back over his shoulder. The wolves were still there. He could not always see them clearly through the storm, but he felt them. Shadows drifting beyond the snow. Patient, waiting for him to slow down, waiting for the mountain to finish what it had started. The path narrowed sharply between two towering walls of stone coated in ice. Snow no longer fell straight down here. It twisted violently through the gap, like smoke trapped inside a tunnel. Ethan pressed one hand against the cliff for balance as he moved forward. The rock burned with cold even through his glove. Somewhere ahead, the leopard emerged briefly from the storm before vanishing again around another bend. It never looked frightened, never rushed. The animal moved through the blizzard as though it belonged to it. Ethan could barely understand how anything alive survived in this place. His legs shook harder now. The injured knee from the crash kept threatening to collapse beneath him. More than once he nearly fell face first into the snow. Each time he forced himself upright again, repeating the same thought inside his head. Keep moving. Whatever happens, do not stop moving. Then the wind changed. One moment the storm screamed through the cliffs. The next, the sound dropped suddenly into an eerie silence. Ethan frowned weakly and looked upward. The mountains above him had disappeared completely behind thick curtains of blowing snow. But something felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavier now. Still, the snow leopard froze several yards ahead. Its ears lifted slightly. For the first time since Ethan had seen the animal, it looked uncertain. A low cracking sound echoed somewhere deep within the mountain. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. He had heard that sound before during winter expeditions farther north. Ice shifting beneath pressure. Snow separating from rock. Avalanche. The realization hit him too late. A deep rumble rolled across the cliffs as the entire mountain seemed to tremble beneath his boots. Ethan looked back just as a massive wall of snow exploded down the ridge behind him, swallowing the narrow pass where the wolves had been moments earlier. The sound was overwhelming, like the mountain itself collapsing apart. Ethan tried to run, but his exhausted body barely responded. Snow surged through the canyon in violent waves, filling the air so completely he could not see anything anymore. Then something slammed hard into his side. He crashed into the snow as strong weight pressed against him. Thick fur, powerful limbs. The snow leopard. The animal forced Ethan down against the rocks just as freezing wind and heavy snow roared over them. Ethan covered his face instinctively while the avalanche thundered past the narrow cliff opening only yards away. Ice and snow sprayed across his jacket hard enough to sting through the fabric. The entire world became white noise and freezing darkness. Then, slowly, the mountain grew silent again. Ethan coughed hard and pushed himself upright, trembling violently now from cold and shock. Snow covered nearly everything around them. The path behind had vanished completely beneath piles of ice and debris. For several seconds he simply stared, trying to process how close he had come to disappearing beneath the mountain forever. Beside him, the snow leopard stood slowly and shook frost from its thick coat. Ethan noticed something then that made his chest tighten. Fresh blood stained the white fur near the animal's shoulder, faint but visible even beneath the snow. The leopard had been hurt shielding him from the avalanche. Yet instead of retreating into the wilderness, it stepped closer to Ethan once more and looked toward a dark opening hidden farther inside the cliffs. A cave, shelter, warmth, maybe survival. Ethan swallowed hard as another distant howl drifted across the frozen mountains behind them. Somehow the wolves were still out there. The cave was not much more than a crack hidden inside the mountain, but the moment Ethan crossed into the darkness, the wind lost its grip on him. Silence settled heavily around the narrow chamber except for the distant storm still raging outside. Ethan nearly collapsed against the stone wall as exhaustion crashed through him all at once. His entire body trembled violently now. Snow melted slowly from his jacket and gloves, soaking through the fabric before freezing again near the floor of the cave. He could barely feel his hands anymore. Even breathing took effort. For several seconds, he simply stood there staring into the darkness, trying to understand how he was still alive. Outside, the mountain should have buried him beneath tons of snow. The wolves should have reached him long before the avalanche. Yet somehow he had survived both. Slowly, Ethan looked toward the cave entrance. The snow leopard remained there, partially silhouetted against the pale storm outside. It did not enter fully. It stayed near the opening as though guarding it. Snow drifted across the thick white fur along its back, while cold air curled around its body. Ethan noticed the blood again near the animal's shoulder. The wound was not deep, but against fur that pale, even a small injury looked unsettling. The leopard lowered itself carefully onto the stone near the entrance without taking its eyes off the storm outside. Ethan swallowed hard. Every instinct still warned him not to trust a predator large enough to overpower him effortlessly. But the animal had already protected him more than once. None of it made sense. He slowly removed his backpack and searched through what little remained inside after the crash. One emergency blanket, a flashlight with weak batteries, half a protein bar crushed into pieces. Ethan let out a tired laugh under his breath. 3 hours earlier, he had been mapping remote terrain from a snowmobile. Now he was trapped inside a frozen cave beside one of the rarest predators on Earth. While wolves circled somewhere beyond the storm, the mountain had turned his life into something unreal. He wrapped the emergency blanket tightly around himself and slid down against the wall. Fatigue pressed against his eyelids immediately. Dangerous fatigue. Ethan knew he could not sleep yet. People who gave in to exhaustion during severe cold often never woke up again. He forced himself to stay conscious by watching the leopard near the entrance. The animal barely moved. Only its ears shifted occasionally toward distant sounds outside. Time passed strangely inside the cave. Minutes felt longer beneath the constant weight of the storm. Ethan's thoughts drifted in and out as his body fought to hold on to warmth. At one point, he noticed the leopard stand suddenly. Its posture changed instantly, muscles tightening beneath thick fur. Ethan heard it too a second later. Crunching footsteps outside. Slow. Careful. The wolves had found the cave. Ethan's pulse hammered painfully in his chest as shadows moved beyond the blowing snow outside the entrance. One shape appeared briefly through the storm before disappearing again. Then another farther back. The pack was searching the cliffs. The leopard stepped closer to the entrance and lowered its head slightly. No growling. No panic. Just stillness. The kind of stillness predators carried when they understood danger completely. Ethan held his breath without realizing it. The cave suddenly felt much smaller. The wolves lingered outside for what felt like forever. Sometimes Ethan could hear their footsteps circling somewhere beyond the rocks. Other times only silence remained, which somehow felt worse. Then one howl echoed close enough to vibrate through the stone beneath him. The leopard's tail moved once across the ground. Ethan realized then that the animal had not stayed inside the cave to hide from the storm. It had stayed there to keep the wolves from entering. Hours passed before the sounds finally faded deeper into the mountains again. Ethan let out a shaky breath and closed his eyes briefly in relief. But when he opened them again, he noticed something strange. The leopard was staring directly at him now. Not like an animal watching prey. Something different. Calm. Measuring. Almost as if it was waiting to see whether he would survive the night. Ethan slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the crushed remains of the protein bar. His frozen fingers broke off a small piece before he hesitated. The idea felt insane. Still, after everything that had happened, insanity no longer seemed impossible in this mountain. Ethan carefully slid the piece of food across the stone toward the leopard. The animal stared at it for several seconds without moving. Then slowly, almost cautiously, it stepped forward out of the shadows for the first time. The storm outside never truly stopped. It only changed shape. Sometimes the wind screamed hard enough to shake snow loose from the cliffs above the cave. Other times the mountains became so silent Ethan could hear his own heartbeat echoing inside his ears. He sat motionless against the frozen stone while the snow leopard stared at the small piece of protein bar between them. For a long moment neither moved. Then the animal stepped forward slowly, each movement careful and controlled, its pale eyes never leaving Ethan completely. Up close, the leopard looked even larger than he realized before. Thick white fur covered powerful shoulders built for surviving places no human should ever walk through alone. Frost clung to its whiskers. The faint blood near its shoulder had frozen dark against the snow-colored coat. Ethan held his breath as the animal lowered its head and sniffed the food cautiously before taking it gently between its teeth. The movement was almost silent. No aggression, no fear, just quiet acceptance. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall and let out a weak breath he did not realize he had been holding. Somehow that tiny moment changed everything inside the cave. The mountain outside still wanted him dead. The wolves were still somewhere beyond the storm. But for the first time since the crash, Ethan no longer felt completely alone. The leopard returned to the entrance afterward and settled near the opening once more, keeping watch over the darkness outside. Ethan studied the animal carefully now. Every few minutes its ears shifted toward sounds hidden beneath the wind. Once, It lifted its head sharply and stared into the storm long enough to make Ethan nervous again. But whatever it sensed eventually faded. Hours passed slowly. Ethan drifted between exhaustion and awareness while cold crept deeper into the cave. Even sheltered from the wind, the temperature remained brutally low. His wet clothes had started freezing stiff around his arms and legs. He knew if he stayed there too long without warmth, the cold would eventually win anyway. His thoughts moved sluggishly now. Dangerous signs. He forced himself to stay awake by focusing on small details around him. The uneven cracks in the cave walls. The sound of snow sliding outside. The slow breathing of the leopard near the entrance. Then something unexpected happened. The animal stood and disappeared briefly into the storm. Ethan's chest tightened instantly. Panic rose before he could stop it. He suddenly realized how much his survival now depended on a predator he still barely understood. Several minutes passed. The cave felt colder without the leopard there. Emptier. Ethan stared toward the entrance anxiously as wind pushed snow across the opening. Then finally the animal returned. Something small hung from its mouth. A snow hare. Ethan blinked in disbelief as the leopard dropped the animal several feet away from him before lying down again near the entrance as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan stared at the hare for several seconds, unable to process what he was seeing. Predators hunted. That was normal. But this felt different. The leopard had not hidden its catch. It had brought it back to the cave. To him. Ethan looked toward the animal again, but the leopard had already turned its attention back toward the storm outside. The mountain suddenly felt stranger than ever before. Ethan swallowed hard and forced himself to move closer to the small emergency kit inside his backpack. His hands shook badly as he searched for the compact survival lighter buried beneath frozen supplies. It took several attempts before a weak flame finally sparked to life. Relief flooded through him instantly. Carefully, Ethan gathered scraps of dry material from inside the cave along with loose fabric from the ruined lining of his backpack. After several tense minutes, a tiny fire finally flickered weakly against the rocks. The warmth was almost nothing, but in temperatures like this, almost nothing could still save a life. Orange light filled the cave softly for the first time. The leopard lifted its head slightly, watching the flames without fear. Ethan slowly warmed his numb hands near the fire while exhaustion weighed heavily against his body. Outside, snow continued falling endlessly across the mountains. But inside the cave, beneath the weak glow of firelight, the impossible silence between man and predator no longer felt hostile. It felt fragile, temporary, like something the storm itself could take away at any moment. Then Ethan noticed the leopard suddenly rise to its feet again. Its body stiffened instantly. Not toward the storm this time, toward something deeper inside the mountain behind them. A low sound echoed faintly through the darkness beyond the cave walls. Not wind, not wolves, something heavier moving beneath the ice. The sound came again from somewhere beyond the back of the cave, low and distant beneath the mountain like ice grinding slowly against stone. Ethan stiffened instantly beside the small fire. The snow leopard remained completely still near the darkness deeper inside the cave, its pale eyes fixed on something hidden far beyond human sight. The flames crackled weakly between them, throwing trembling shadows across the frozen walls. Ethan listened carefully. At first the noise almost blended with the storm outside, but then it came again. A deep shifting groan beneath the ice. Not close enough to be immediate danger, but close enough to remind him the entire mountain around them was alive and unstable. He swallowed hard and stared deeper into the darkness behind the leopard. The cave extended farther than he realized before. Narrow passages disappeared beyond the weak reach of the firelight, twisting somewhere into the mountain itself. Ethan suddenly understood why the leopard had chosen this place. It was hidden well enough that the wolves outside could not reach them easily. But caves inside frozen mountains carried dangers of their own. Ice shifted constantly during storms like this. One collapse in the wrong place could seal them inside forever. The thought sent another wave of unease through him. The leopard moved first. Slowly, silently, it stepped away from the entrance and disappeared a few feet into the darkness beyond the firelight. Ethan watched carefully as the animal lowered its head near the cave wall, listening. Then, after several tense seconds, the leopard relaxed slightly and returned toward the entrance again. Whatever the sound had been, It no longer seemed immediate. Ethan let out a quiet breath and rubbed his freezing hands near the small flames. His fingers hurt badly now as sensation slowly returned to them. The pain almost felt comforting. It meant his body had not completely surrendered to the cold yet. Outside, the storm continued, burying the mountain beneath fresh layers of snow. Ethan wondered how long he had been trapped inside the cave already. 6 hours maybe. More. Tom no longer felt normal in the mountains. There was only darkness, cold, and survival measured one breath at a time. His eyes drifted again toward the snow leopard resting near the entrance. The impossible reality of the situation still had not fully settled inside his mind. Back home, people paid thousands of dollars for a chance to glimpse one of these animals through binoculars from miles away. Most never saw anything. Snow leopards were called ghosts of the mountains for a reason. Silent, rare, nearly invisible in their own world. Yet somehow one now sat only a few feet from him beside a fire in the middle of a deadly storm. Ethan noticed the animal favoring its injured shoulder slightly whenever it shifted position. The wound from the avalanche looked worse beneath the firelight. Not life-threatening, but painful enough. Carefully, Ethan reached into his backpack again and pulled out the small medical kit stored inside. Most of the supplies had been damaged during the crash, but one roll of gauze and a small antiseptic bottle remained usable. He stared at them uncertainly before glancing back toward the leopard. The idea felt dangerous, stupid even. Wild animals were unpredictable no matter how calm they appeared. Still, the leopard had already protected him more times than he could explain. Ethan slowly moved forward across the stone floor, careful not to make sudden movements. The leopard immediately lifted its head, pale eyes locking onto him. Ethan stopped. The cave suddenly felt very small again. Easy, he whispered softly, his voice rough from cold and exhaustion. The leopard watched him silently without moving. Ethan carefully placed the medical supplies onto the ground a few feet away and slowly sat back again, giving the animal space. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then the leopard lowered its head once more, though its eyes never completely left him. Ethan almost laughed quietly to himself. Somehow trust inside this frozen mountain was forming in the strangest way imaginable. Not through words, not through understanding, just survival. The fire burned lower over time until only glowing embers remained. Exhaustion weighed heavier against Ethan with every passing minute. His body wanted sleep desperately now. Dangerous sleep. But eventually even fear could not overpower fatigue forever. Ethan pulled the emergency blanket tighter around himself and leaned back carefully against the stone wall. The leopard remained near the entrance watching the storm outside, while snow drifted silently across the cave opening. Ethan's eyes slowly began to close despite his effort to stay awake. Just before sleep finally reached him, he heard something again outside the cave. Footsteps crunching softly through deep snow. Slow. Careful. Not wolves this time. Too heavy. Ethan woke instantly. Not because of the cold this time, but because the snow leopard was standing over him. The animal's body blocked part of the dying firelight as its ears pointed sharply toward the cave entrance. Outside, the storm had weakened enough for sound to travel farther through the mountains. Ethan heard the footsteps again, slow crunching through deep snow just beyond the rocks. Heavy, deliberate. He forced himself upright against the wall, every muscle in his body aching from cold and exhaustion. For one brief moment, he wondered if rescue had finally come. Maybe another expedition team searching the mountains. Maybe emergency crews tracking the snowmobile's signal before it died. But the feeling vanished almost immediately. No voices echoed outside. No engines. Only silence between each heavy step. The leopard moved away from Ethan and lowered itself near the entrance once more, its body tense in a way Ethan had not seen before. Not fear. Readiness. The fire near the center of the cave flickered weakly as wind drifted through the opening. Ethan slowly reached for the flashlight beside him and clicked it on carefully. The beam was weak now, barely cutting through the darkness. He aimed it toward the entrance just as another shadow moved outside. Large. Broad. Much larger than the wolves. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. A dark figure crossed briefly through the blowing snow before disappearing behind the cliffs again. Then another sound followed. A deep snort carried through the freezing air. Ethan felt his pulse spike hard against his ribs. Bears sometimes moved through mountain regions like this searching for shelter during brutal storms, especially when food became scarce. In weather this severe, even predators avoided unnecessary risks. But something desperate enough to approach the cave now was dangerous. The leopard remained perfectly silent, though Ethan noticed the fur along its back rise slightly. Outside, the heavy footsteps stopped completely. The silence afterward felt worse than the noise itself. Ethan could hear the weak crackling of the fire, the distant wind, his own uneven breathing. Then slowly, a massive shape appeared at the entrance. Ethan's flashlight caught part of it through the snow. Thick dark fur covered in frost. A broad head lowering toward the opening. A mountain bear. Ethan froze completely. The animal did not enter the cave immediately. It sniffed the cold air carefully, likely catching the scent of fire, blood, and two exhausted living creatures hiding inside the mountain. The cave suddenly felt impossibly small. Ethan barely breathed as the bear stepped one paw closer toward the entrance. The snow leopard rose instantly too, its feet between Ethan and the opening. Neither predator made a sound. They simply stared at one another while snow drifted through the freezing air around them. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He understood then how fragile survival truly was inside these mountains. Nature did not divide creatures into heroes and monsters. Hunger, cold, survival. Those were the only laws out here. The bear shifted its weight slowly, studying the cave. Ethan could smell the cold animal scent mixing with snow and smoke now. The leopard remained directly in front of the opening, smaller than the bear, but completely unmoving. Time stretched painfully. Seconds felt endless. Then the mountain itself interrupted the silence. A loud crack echoed somewhere above the cliffs outside, followed by a deep rolling groan beneath the snow. The bear immediately lifted its head toward the sound. Instinct moved faster than thought. Without hesitation, the massive animal backed away from the cave entrance and disappeared into the storm again. A moment later, snow cascaded from somewhere higher on the mountain outside. Not a full avalanche this time, but enough to shake the cliffs around them. Ice dust drifted down from the cave ceiling. Ethan let out a shaking breath he did not realize he had been holding. The leopard stayed near the entrance several more seconds before finally relaxing slightly. But the brief encounter had changed something inside Ethan. Until now, part of him still believed he was surviving through luck alone, that eventually the mountains would stop testing him. Now he understood the truth. The storm was not ending. The dangers were not passing. The mountain would keep sending one threat after another until either he adapted or disappeared beneath the snow like countless others before him. Ethan looked toward the leopard again as the animal slowly returned to its place near the entrance. The weak firelight reflected softly in its pale eyes. Somewhere during the endless cold and darkness, the predator had stopped feeling like part of the danger. It had become the only reason Ethan was still alive. Outside, dawn finally began creeping faintly through the storm clouds for the first time since the crash. But as weak gray light touched the mountains beyond the cave, Ethan noticed something waiting far below the cliffs. Dark figures moving slowly across the snow. The wolves had not left. Dawn did not bring warmth to the mountain. It only revealed how trapped Ethan truly was. Pale gray light spread slowly across the cliffs outside the cave, exposing endless fields of untouched snow broken only by the dark shapes moving below. The wolves had stayed through the entire night. Ethan counted at least 6 now circling farther down the ridge, their movements patient and controlled, as if they already understood the storm would eventually force him back outside. The snow leopard remained near the cave entrance, watching them silently. Its injured shoulder looked stiffer this morning, though the animal never showed weakness openly. Ethan pulled the emergency blanket tighter around himself and tried to steady his breathing. The fire had almost died completely. Only faint glowing embers remained between scattered blackened stones. He knew staying inside the cave forever was impossible. His supplies were nearly gone. The mountain cold would eventually drain whatever strength he had left. And if another storm buried the entrance, neither of them would survive long enough to see rescue. Ethan slowly forced himself onto his feet despite the pain shooting through his injured knee. Every muscle in his body felt heavy and exhausted. The cold had settled deep inside him now, harder to escape even beside fire. He stepped carefully toward the cave entrance and stared across the frozen landscape outside. Visibility had improved slightly since the storm weakened overnight. Far beyond the cliffs, he could finally see part of the lower valley cutting through the mountains. And there, nearly hidden beneath drifting snow, Ethan noticed something that made his pulse quicken instantly. A structure. Small. Dark against the white landscape. Maybe half a mile away. A cabin. At first he thought exhaustion was creating illusions again, but the shape remained there even after he blinked several times. A narrow trail of snow-covered fencing stretched. Beside it, almost completely buried beneath the storm. Human shelter. Real shelter. Ethan let out a weak breath of disbelief. If the cabin still stood intact, there might be supplies inside. Heat. A working radio. Enough to survive until rescue finally reached the mountains. But reaching it would mean crossing open terrain while the wolves still waited below. Ethan glanced toward the leopard. The animal followed his gaze toward the distant cabin before looking back at the wolves again. Somehow the predator already seemed to understand the choice ahead of them. Stay inside the cave and slowly freeze. Or leave and risk the mountain once more. Ethan grabbed his backpack and forced himself to move. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a wall. Wind still swept across the ridge hard enough to sting exposed skin. Snow crunched beneath his frozen boots as he carefully descended the narrow path leading away from the cave. The leopard moved ahead of him silently through the drifts, occasionally stopping to glance back and make sure Ethan continued following. The wolves noticed almost immediately. Ethan saw them shifting farther below the ridge, tracking their movement through the snow. Not rushing. Waiting. The descent toward the valley felt endless. Several times Ethan nearly slipped where ice hid beneath fresh powder. His injured knee weakened more with every step. But the cabin slowly grew clearer through the drifting snow ahead. Hope pushed him forward now where exhaustion could not. Then the mountain changed again. A harsh wind suddenly rolled down from the cliffs above, carrying thick snow across the valley floor. Visibility dropped sharply within seconds. Ethan stopped instinctively, shielding his eyes against the blowing ice. The leopard froze ahead of him, body tense. Something was wrong. Ethan heard it a moment later. The wolves were moving faster now. Dark shapes emerged through the storm on both sides of the ridge, using the thick snow as cover while slowly closing the distance. Ethan's pulse hammered painfully in his chest. They had waited until the open valley to move closer. The cabin remained visible ahead, but still too far away. Ethan stumbled backward against a snow-covered rock, trying to keep sight of the shifting shapes around him. The leopard stepped directly in front of him again, low and silent against the storm. Snow whipped across its pale fur, while the wolves circled wider through the blowing white haze. The wind howled louder now, erasing distance, erasing direction, erasing everything except survival. Ethan's breathing became uneven again as panic pressed hard against his chest. The mountain had given him hope only to strip safety away moments later. Then suddenly the leopard moved. Not toward the wolves. Toward the cabin. The animal sprinted through the storm before stopping farther ahead and turning back toward Ethan as if demanding he follow immediately. Ethan gritted his teeth and forced his exhausted body forward through the snow. Behind them, the wolves began moving faster too. The cabin looked close enough to touch, yet every step toward it felt heavier than the last. Snow blasted sideways across the valley as Ethan forced himself through the drifts behind the snow leopard. His injured knee burned with every movement now, threatening to give out completely beneath him. Behind them, the wolves moved like shadows through the storm, spreading wider across the open terrain. Ethan could no longer tell how far away they were. Sometimes he caught glimpses of pale eyes between the blowing snow. Other times he only heard the faint crunch of movement somewhere beyond the wind. The mountain had become a maze of white silence and hidden danger. The leopard stopped briefly atop a ridge of snow and looked back toward Ethan again. Its breathing had grown heavier too. The injured shoulder slowed it slightly now, though the animal never stopped moving forward. Ethan pushed harder despite the exhaustion crushing his body. The cabin was real. He could see the outline clearly now. A small trapper shelter half buried beneath snow beside a line of frozen trees. One side of the roof had partially collapsed, but the structure still stood against the storm. Survival waited only a little farther ahead. Then Ethan's boot suddenly punched through hidden ice beneath the snow. Pain shot through his injured leg as he crashed hard against the frozen ground. His backpack slid several feet away into the drifts. Ethan gasped sharply and tried to stand, but his knee refused to support him. Panic surged through his chest instantly. The wolves noticed too. Dark shapes shifted faster through the storm now, circling closer across the valley. The snow leopard spun around immediately and moved back toward Ethan. The animal stood directly between him and the approaching shadows once again, pale fur whipping violently in the wind. Ethan grabbed desperately at the snow, trying to pull himself upright. His fingers had become so numb he could barely feel them anymore. The cold was winning. He could sense it now inside his thoughts. Everything felt slower, distant. The dangerous calm that came before the body finally surrendered. One wolf emerged clearly through the storm, only 30 feet away before stopping. Then another farther behind it. The pack had become bolder. Ethan's breathing turned ragged as he struggled to stand again. The cabin remained painfully close now, maybe 100 yards away, close enough to survive, too far for his failing body to reach alone. Then the leopard did something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. The animal stepped closer to him and lowered itself slightly beside him against the snow. At first Ethan did not understand. Then he realized the leopard was shielding him from the wind. Its thick body blocked part of the freezing gusts slamming across the valley, giving him just enough protection to breathe properly again. Ethan stared at the animal in disbelief through the swirling snow. No fear remained now, only something deeper, something impossible. Gathering the last strength left inside him, Ethan forced himself upright using the frozen rocks nearby for support. The moment he stood again, the leopard moved immediately toward the cabin. Ethan followed as fast as his damaged leg allowed. The wolves continued shadowing them through the storm, but none moved closer while the leopard remained between them and Ethan. Finally, the cabin reached them through the white haze. Ethan grabbed the frozen handle and shoved hard against the wooden door. At first, nothing happened. Snow and ice had sealed it shut. He slammed his shoulder against it again with a desperate burst of strength. The door suddenly cracked open inward. Warmth did not greet him inside. The cabin was abandoned long ago. Dust, broken shelves, old blankets frozen stiff with time. But it had walls, a roof, shelter from the mountain. Ethan stumbled inside and collapsed against the floor while the storm roared outside the broken windows. For several seconds, he simply lay there gasping for breath, too exhausted to move another inch. Then he looked toward the doorway. The snow leopard